In this video, I want to have a conversation about how intrapersonal communication, one of those 5 forms that we discussed at the beginning of the semester, actually informs 3 different aspects of our life. I'm hoping to do this every week when we dive into a new form of communication to really center us to be thinking about how the form in and of itself isn't only applicable in one context, but it's actually applicable across many. So the first thing that I want to do is remind us what intrapersonal communication actually is. Again, this is one of those forms of communication that is the least researched among all 5, in that it's a lot of interior communication, if you want to think about it that way. You are communicating with yourself within your own head, or maybe even written words on a page or something to maybe remind you of what you're thinking about in your environment. But the goal of intrapersonal communication is not to share something with the world, with others, but to really remind yourself or tell yourself something. Specifically, what I want to focus on is how intrapersonal communication is heavily tied to the self and the self concept. We're going to be digging into this a little bit in future lecture videos, but you really need to be thinking about how intrapersonal communication is informed by and informs how you are communicating with others. Because intrapersonal communication is all about who you believe yourself to be and what you take from that into situations and conversations with other people. Whenever we talk about the 3 different contexts that this might apply to, we can think about how this might manifest in different ways. So I want to start with the spiritual. When we think about our faith or our religion or our spiritual communication with ourselves, this type of communication can look several different ways. One thing that I think is really interesting is to think about how our ideas about ourselves can actually influence our prayer life. There's a book written quite a few years ago that talked about who I am is how I pray. And this is a really interesting component to think about because often prayer is not something that we do out loud. There could be instances where we are praying out loud, but usually when that happens, we are praying for other people and it's not just something for ourselves. So when prayer happens in your head, yes, you might be communicating with God, you might be praying with somebody or to somebody, but all of that communication is staying inside your own mind. And what's going to come out in that, in an intrapersonal sense, is your personality, your self-concept. I am going to pray differently than how you pray. And what that is reflective of is what I think about myself and how I think that I need to communicate about my needs or my wants or my desires, how I need to think about my relationship with God. And so you can think about how your thoughts on who you are, on what you value, on what you believe, on how you think you interact with people actually influences how you pray. Another thing to keep in mind too is that intrapersonal communication happens when you're reminding yourself of things throughout the day. Maybe you aren't consciously aware of the fact that you are talking to yourself, but there are moments when we're walking across campus or when we're grocery shopping or maybe even driving when we're thinking about stuff. And sometimes the intrapersonal communication that's happening there can be things that are tied to our spiritual life. For instance, I have some letter boards like the one on the back wall in my office. And one of those I tend to keep as a quote dealing with gratitude in some way, shape, or form, because that's a message that I continuously tell myself in the bounds of my own head as a reminder to be grateful for the things that I have or the experiences that I'm going through. That in and of itself is a spiritual practice of practicing gratitude. And if I'm not saying it outwardly, it's not because it's not something that I want other people to know, but it's something that I want to remind myself of daily. Outside of the spiritual, we can also think about how intrapersonal communication can be connected to relational communication or relationships or relationship contexts. This might be a hard stretch for some people because if you're only communicating within your own head, how can this apply to others? How can this apply to relationships? One thing to think about is that we are often reflecting in our own minds on who we want to be in a relationship, whether that's a friendship, a familial relationship, a romantic relationship. we have this idea of what we think we bring to the relationship as a whole and what we want to bring or how we want that relationship to look. So those reflections on what you want your role to be in a relationship or what you want your friendship, workplace relationship, familial relationship to look like, those things are happening in your head and you're reflecting on experiences. You're reflecting on things that you've said or done and thinking about whether or not that's going to be a meaningful, positive experience and interaction to move a relationship forward. Now, those intrapersonal communications might become outward manifestations at some point. You might talk to a friend about a conflict that you had and how you felt you handled it. But at first, it might be something that is simply internal. Lastly, I want to talk about professional contexts and interpersonal communication. This is something that I think that is interesting because often when we're tackling workplace projects or we're applying for a job or we're trying to do something career-based with our life, we have this voice in the back of our head, which might be our own, that's telling us about our worth of what we're doing or how good we are at what we're doing in that moment. This is something that's particularly salient to me because my son has recently been very engrossed in the Cars movies. And Lightning McQueen is someone who does intrapersonal communication to himself about his job all the time. At the beginning of every movie, it seems, it's a black screen and all you hear is Lightning McQueen saying to himself, "I am speed."
I am speed.
And it's really adorable to see a 3-year-old saying that to himself with his eyes shut. But that's intrapersonal communication. That is you telling yourself, I'm good at what I'm doing, or I have the ability to do this thing really well. And often we can find ourselves either doubting our abilities that we have to complete a job, or we have confidence in what we are doing and we feel like we have the tools needed to do something really well. And your viewpoint on how you think you're doing, or if you have the skills to do something well, that message that you're telling yourself is going to impact the work that you actually do. And so we're going to spend the first week digging into this form of communication, focusing on and maybe asking yourself hard questions about what messages do you tell yourself? Do you tell yourself, I'm good at what I do, I have a lot of talents, or do you tell yourself, I don't really know that I'm good at anything? Because that in of itself is going to impact all of your future conversations, interactions, and essentially the work that you're going to be doing. Intrapersonally, I don't know how I feel about that. Yes, okay. I am speed. I did the thing.